Good morning. As Marcus has said, my name is Jen Robson. I head up the Economics Insight and Advice team at Seafish. So I get the pleasure of sharing with you our data sets and what we do with them. And this is one of our sort of flagship pieces of work that helps everybody to access the data that we collect and process here at Seafish. As we go through, I will also be letting you know about the slightly more scientific outputs that sit at the next level down and the level below that, be it within each section. So you'll have the opportunity, if you want to dip into some of our other resources that can dig a little deeper and tell you a bit more about what's going on specifically. If you want to know even more than that, you are very welcome to reach out to myself and to my colleagues in the Economics Market Insight and Trade team, and we'd be more than happy to dig into the data for you and try to answer some very specific questions. We do that as part of our teamwork as well. So without further ado, I'll give you a quick overview of what I intend to cover today, and then we'll get stuck into all the nice data pieces. So hopefully that's moved on to a contents page for you. So what we're going to do today is to look at where our seafood comes from. We'll start with imports, aquaculture and landings. We're then going to look at the processing sector, moving on to retail, food service and all of the seafood that is then exported. So, where does our seafood come from? So, most of the seafood that we eat is imported into the UK, and the value of seafood imports was nearly 4.5 times the value of fish landed into the UK in 2024. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to be referring to the 2024 data. We're always collecting a year after in lieu of the work that we're able to present. So please bear in mind that this is the 2024 data set, which is the latest published data set. However, when you work with us on a one-to-one basis, we may be able to access monthly data for some areas that's slightly more up to date, as we are currently collecting data for the 2025 data sets. So as you can see, there's significantly more imports than there are landed species. So let's dig into that a little bit more. So imports into the UK in 2024 were 3,839 million, the equivalent of a +4 increase from 2023. Fish farmed in the UK in 2023, this is the exception to the rule. We are not the data collector of aquaculture data, so we're reliant on our colleagues in other parts of government, and the latest data set available for aquaculture is 2023. So whenever I refer to aquaculture, it will be the 2023 data. But again, 1,252 million. This is slightly lower than the year before. We know that aquaculture value can be go through cyclical cycles. The nature of aquaculture means that some species are not ready for sale every single year. So we do see some slight fluctuations here in the values and the tonnage each year. So this is not surprising that there's a slight downward trend. We are seeing an increase in the prevalence of aquaculture on the whole, but that data just showed what went to market in that year. So if I move on to fish landed in the UK, 828 million, and the equivalent of 481,241 tonnes. Again, they are up on the year before, in value by about 3% and in volume by about 8%. So if we move now on to our import data, the biggest The biggest area of interest in the 2024 period was that the non-tariff barriers continued to impact EU trade. There was a number of health certificates, border checks, and testing costs increased for UK exporters. There was also a new piece of sanitary and phytosanitary legislation that came into place, offering potential relief, but also diversification. The CPTPP also was in discussion, and also trade deals with India and the US. So there was a lot going on the non-tariff barriers and addressing those from a governmental perspective. And this influenced the overall picture of imports. And we've dug into some of these issues in more detail in our trade report and in our supply chain report. So if you would like more information on those, you can click on the links when we circulate this slide deck, and the trade report link will take you directly to the trade report, and so on and so forth for the other tools. In terms of our imports, it returned to growth in 2024. We saw rising domestic demand and also global supply shifts, with new countries, particularly in the Far East, demanding increased volumes of import, increased volumes from the UK, or sending us an increase in volumes of their caught species. We also saw strong growth in pelagic species, up 15%, but whitefish remains the largest category for us. Key suppliers to the UK were Ecuador, Canada, Vietnam, Norway, and the EU. And the global trade environment remained volatile with geopolitical tensions, Ukraine particularly, Gaza conflicts, and some uncertainty between the US and China. This resulted in US tariffs, and that threatened trade flows, particularly for the warm water prawn exporters. So there were a number of things that affected imports during this period. So let's look at our top 5 countries for import in terms of value. So as you can see, Norway remains our top country, Iceland closely behind, China slightly down from the year before, Vietnam up significantly, and the Netherlands continues to be a trading hub. So we do expect a lot of trade, both import and export, to go through the Netherlands. It's down 18% in the 2024 data, but does remain one of the most significant trading hubs in Europe. So we still have a very close trading relationship with the Netherlands. So if we look at volume in terms of live weight tons, China is where the volume of our seafood is coming from. And Norway, in terms of whitefish, Norway and Iceland, significant suppliers to the UK. Again, the Netherlands is being used as a trade hub, and Vietnam is beginning to build its domestic supply to us, up 10%. And we've done some work with Vietnam with our trade teams over that period as well. So if I move on to the top 5 species imported, what we're interested in consuming in the UK remains to be salmon, shrimps and prawns, cod, tuna and haddock. And these dominate the species by both value and volume in terms of what we import and what we consume. And this differs to the species that we catch, and I'll show you how it differs when we get to the landings part of the presentation. So I'm going to move on to aquaculture now. Please bear in mind that aquaculture is a data set that's not collected by Seafish. So it is the latest data set available to us is the 2023 data. and that's why there's a slight difference in year between this data set and the rest of the data in the presentation. So aquaculture is the fastest growing food supply sector globally. Farmed salmon continues to be the most valuable food export for us in the UK, and aquaculture production decreased slightly, but there was a sharp rise in carp production for recreational fishing. We did see a number of people become interested in recreational fishing during the pandemic, and this is something that seems to have embedded post-pandemic, and is on the rise as a hobby in the UK, and that's reflected through the carp production there, because the carp's not an eating species. So if we look at the top 5 species by volume, by far Atlantic salmon is the top species, although this is down 7% in 2023. Rainbow trout has grown slightly by up 6%. Sea mussels up 30%, and we've been doing a lot of work around mussels, and there's been some interesting projects at Seafish around mussels, and we could refer to you to those sets of data or to those projects outcomes if you are interested in mussels. Pacific cupped oysters, again, also up. Seafood for Life looked at the health benefit of both mussels and oysters. That's another piece of work that we've done over the past year. So there's lots of work going on in the background of the aquaculture data sets that helps us to understand aquaculture's significance as part of our food security agenda, as part of our health agenda, and as part of the changing behaviours of consumers in the UK, both in food service and in retail, and I'll touch on that later in the presentation. So top 5 species by volume was Atlantic salmon, no surprises there. Sea mussels was also up 13%. Rainbow trout remained the same, and cupped oysters were slightly down at 6%, and common carp increased 26%, but as we've said, this is due mainly to the recreational sector. So now if we look at our landings, we have a number of resources on landings as well. The most significant piece of work that we do every year from the economics team is something called our Economics of the Fishing Fleet report. And that report is based on a programme of work that we conduct on an annual basis, where we send up to 5 researchers around the UK to ports and harbours to collect data from fishermen directly to look at the state of the fleet. That data is then collated internally at Seafish, cleansed and reviewed, and the data is then written into our Economics of the Fleet report. So you will see us out and about every year in the different ports and harbours around the UK collecting the data. And we have lots of opportunities each year for young researchers to join the team on a temporary basis to be part of that programme, and it's one of our sort of probably most exciting programmes of the year, and always something that we enjoy analysing. So I've given you a link there to our latest report. We're currently analysing the data from the 2025 data collection exercise, and that will be published in 2026. So if I move on to what does the data tell us? Landings in the UK in 2024 were 716,000 tonnes of fish and shellfish. The majority of landings were into UK ports, mainly Peterhead, Lerwick and Newlyn. Landings abroad also took place mainly into Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway and Ireland. That's been a fairly common story for the past few years. We do land abroad. That's not uncommon. That allows for certain species to be directly exported, and also provides sales opportunities straight into those markets as well. We in 2024 caught enough seafood to feed one portion to 60% of the global population. So that just gives you a sense of the scale of the industry, and helps you to understand. I am going to I noticed there's some hands gone up. If you want to put your questions into the Q&A, we'll be able to see them, and then the team will be able to answer at the end of the, because the webinar prevents sound from the participants. So that's the best way to ask any questions. In terms of volumes of landing into the UK, we've split that by the landing type. So demersals was at 26%, pelagic was at 49%, and shellfish made up the remaining 24%. This is interesting to look at in terms of, if we remember the sort of species that we imported to eat, it was dominated by salmon, it was dominated by prawns, it was dominated by whitefish like cod and haddock. If you look at the top 5 species, mackerel, herring, haddock, scallops and blue whiting are the top 5 species that we actually land, but we're not eating all of these. So the majority of our landings of particularly mackerel and herring are exported. Now, this is in part because we can economically benefit from export, but it's in part because we prefer to eat the salmon and the prawns and the haddock and cod that we import from other places. We don't land enough of our own haddock to supply all of our fish and chips restaurants, and the importance of that in our culture. So we do need to top up with imports of other whitefish as well. Hopefully we'll move on. Hopefully you can see the next slide. So this is just to give you some information about the difference between demersal and pelagic species. So it's all due to the part of the ocean where the fish are found. So demersal fish tend to live near the bottom of the sea, known as the demersal zone. The pelagic fish tend to live and feed away from the bottom of the sea, known as the pelagic zone. So that's why we split our references to demersal and pelagic fish. It's all to do with whereabouts in the ocean they are caught. So if we look at the performance of the UK fishing fleet, 2024 was a welcome return to business. For the UK fishing fleet, we saw increases in fishing activity again, we saw increases in income, and we saw increases in market prices. That's not to say that it wasn't a year of challenges. As I said earlier in the presentation, there were lots of potential legislative changes and non-trade barriers. There was geopolitical tensions that caused disruptions, and we're also aware that access to labour for both the fleet and the processing sector remains one of the most challenging areas. So by no means was this a perfect picture, but it was a positive uplift from the years that had gone previously, particularly during the pandemic periods. So, performance of the UK fishing fleet. A total of 1,189 million turnover, an operating profit of 337 million, the equivalent full-time jobs of 7,220 people, and an active fleet of 3,785 vessels. We do separate out the non-active or the inactive vessels, as well. So if anybody's interested in the wider makeup of the fleet, that's something that we can explore. We also, in our fleet report, look at full-time equivalent jobs split by the different regions and geographies, so you can find out the full-time equivalent jobs for Scotland, or you can find out the full-time equivalent jobs for Wales. That is something that you can also do on our economic fishing fleet tool on Tableau. Again, that's something that I've put a link into the document for you, so you should be able to click through, take you directly to the public Tableau tool and allow you to manipulate the data to see different splits. Again, you can do that for fleet operating profit as well. So I would definitely encourage you, if you like data as much as we do in the team, to have a little play with that tool, because it's something that allows you to explore all sorts of numbers that sit behind this data. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the fishing fleet around the UK. So whilst England has more vessels, Scotland remains more productive. Wales and Northern Ireland have a much smaller number of vessels, a much smaller fleet, but contribute significantly to certain species. So really still a very important part of our overall fleet. And in 2024, 26% of landings were landed directly abroad. So only 74% came into the UK. So now we're going to look at the processing sector. So once again, the processing data is collected directly by Seafish. So we run a processing survey every year. This is usually at the beginning of the year. It's done by telephone this time rather than by sending researchers directly into processing facilities. So we will reach out to the whole of the processing sector, primary and secondary processors, and those that have vertically integrated processing. And we will find out from you the state of the processing industry. We then compile that data into something called the processing report, and that is what I've linked here. The team have also created a processing economic tool on Tableau, and we can also send you a link to that. So, seafood processing in the UK is a really important part of our industry. We do import a lot of fish and seafood to process, either for re-export or for consumption within the UK. Our processing industry tends to be concentrated in our coastal regions, and it provides a significant amount of employment for many rural communities. However, as I mentioned, as with the fleet, there's a significant challenge presented by current labour shortages, and the processing sector also faces some challenges around increased production costs, particularly with spikes in energy prices. So these are issues that we also investigate and write impact assessments on and help to provide advice and guidance. So the importance of our processing sector, there's around 340 plus processing sites in the UK. As I've said, these tend to be in coastal areas and are significant contributors to the rural economy. They have full-time equivalent jobs of just over 17,000. But as I said, there is labour shortages, so there are a number of vacancies as well within those sectors, and many companies have been forced to look at automation and other mechanisms in order to maintain their production facilities. So this is something that we are interested in. We're always looking at the efficiency of the processing sector, and it's something that we'd be keen to sort of understand more about, and that's why it's so important, if you can, to try and participate in the processing survey when it comes around, because it really allows us to then help advocate for this area when doing sort of impact assessments and other pieces of work. So whereabouts are these jobs? So East Yorkshire and Northern Lincolnshire and the Humber is the sort of main heart of the UK's processing industry, particularly the English processing industry, with about 5,000 people employed. And then if we look at northeastern Scotland, where there's another 3,500 jobs. So they're the two major processing hubs within the UK. And then for other species, the other parts of Scotland also play a significant role in processing. So southern Scotland, eastern Scotland, and the Highlands and Islands. Particularly important to the Highlands and Islands in terms of its rural economy. So in terms of sites, as you would expect, the two areas with the biggest number of sites is also the two areas with the most people employed. There's also a few sites in Devon processing a different set of species. So now if I move on to retail, all our tools and resources for retail can be found both on our website, but also in a members area called the Market Insight Portal. In order to access the Market Insight Portal, you do need to register. The Market Insight Portal is primarily available for levy payers. It's not available to the press and consultants, so we do screen out some members. They can find more general information on our website, but the Market Insight Portal is specifically to add value to the industry and does target those involved in the industry. On the Market Insight Portal, you will find lots of regularly produced food service and retail data sets, and also food service and retail reports. We produce about 35 reports or fact sheets per year as a team of two in Market Insights, and we currently also purchase monthly data from Nielsen and Circana. So they are the sources of the retail and food service data that you'll find on the Market Insight Portal. So this is one of those did you know things. I won't test you on this later, but if we lined up all the battered seafood that we bought in the UK in 2024, we'd be able to stretch all the way to Australia and back. And you might have seen on our online channels this animation of this graphic, which works really nicely, I think. So in terms of seafood eaten at home, we had quite a difficult period during COVID-19, but thankfully seafood sectors are returning to growth in 2024. Battered seafood remains popular, particularly with those shoppers looking to save money, many recreating fish and chips at home, and then other seafoods such as salmon, sea bass and warm water prawns were also becoming at-home menus as consumers chose to dine in and cook themselves as a strategy to save money. So if we look at the seafood eaten at home, the value of UK retail is about 465 billion, and that's up about 3% from the year before. A large proportion of that is chilled fish. We're always pleasantly encouraged when the proportion of chilled fish being purchased increases, because that means that consumers are scaling up within the sector, moving out of ambient and frozen, and back into chilled fish, which usually is an early indicator of an upturn in people increasing the amount of seafood that they consume or place in their baskets. So this, although it's only 1% up, is a nice early indicator of things to come. Bearing in mind this is 2024 data. We also saw a slight dip in the consumption of fish fingers. You usually see that shift as people switch back out of frozen and back into chilled. There's usually a fairly stable ambient market. That's our tinned fish that we tend to use primarily for lunchtime meal occasions. And that was stable at 14% in terms of value. Same reflected in terms of volume. But good to see chilled starting to increase. So in terms of what we actually eat at home, it mirrors what we import. Salmon, tuna, cod. Pollock has replaced some of the other white fish as a cheaper alternative, allowing us to still enjoy traditional favourites like fish and chips, either making them at home or within our fish and chip restaurants. And warm water prawns have been increasingly appearing in our diets, particularly as we've been influenced by other spices and flavour combinations from different parts of the world. So if we move on to food service, as I said, you'll find all the tools and resources that you need on the Market Insight portal. So I won't go back over that again, but there's another link there should you need it. So if we look at food service, there's an 8.7% increase to 6.4 billion in 2024. This is positive, and it's a return to growth. This is an area that really suffered during the pandemic with hospitality closures, and it's taken a while to recover. But 2024 is much more positive for food service, and we're starting to see consumers returning to eating out of home and to eating in different places. So we're seeing an increase of travel and leisure and the associated eating. We're seeing an increase in full service restaurants again, which is a great place for people to try different seafood species. We're seeing an increase in quick service restaurants as places expand their menus and begin to experiment again. Workplace and education was slightly down as the trend for working from home has continued. Pubs has also been down. We know that the pub sector is important for our older demographic. That's measured as everybody over 65. So apologies if that offends anybody. That's the cut-off for Nielsen rather than Seafish. But we do know that pubs are an important part of the occasions that our over 65 groups eat and consume seafood. And we know that fish and chips is a real favourite in the pub's environment. So that decline is slightly concerning, and it's an area that the team are definitely interested in trying to dig into a little bit further. Fish and chip shops likewise, again, tends to be popular with our slightly older demographics, and again is suffering from a 4% decline. So it's another area that we're interested in sort of finding more about and trying to increase our understanding of the data that sits behind food service. Moving now on to exports. I'm conscious that I've probably talked for a bit longer than I should have done, so I'll try and speed up a little bit. I mentioned previously that we've got a Tableau trade tool. I would definitely encourage you to have a play with this one. It's a really nice tool to use, and the team have spent a lot of time updating it recently. You can play with the different data sets and get all sorts of interesting insights from that. We do produce a biannual trade report, so I've put the link to the most recent one in there. And then once a year, we produce an annual supply chain report that looks from catch all the way to plate across the supply chain and pulls out the key challenges and opportunities that have faced the whole industry throughout that year. So that's a really good sort of holistic read if you want to understand the context of the industry and of the Seafood in Numbers deck. So if we look at exports from the UK, exports are really important to our food and drink sector, particularly to our seafood and fish sector. We exported over 50,000 tonnes more seafood in 2024 than we did in 2023, and the value has increased by 229 million. So as you can see, it's really important to the UK economy that we continue to export. So where does it actually all go? So our key markets in 2024 were the EU, the US, and China. And we had particularly strong performance from salmon and mackerel. So in terms of value, our strongest markets were France, the USA, China, the Netherlands, and Spain. We know that France also had, and the Netherlands are also used as trade hubs. And also have strong processing industries as well. So there may be some secondary processing taking place ready for re-exporting, but we only see the first export data straight out of the UK into other countries. But just to sort of make you aware that that's likely to be happening. And then in terms of volume, again, France, the Netherlands, we'd expect that as they are trade and export hubs. The USA increasing its sourcing from the UK, which is really positive, particularly as they tend to like our higher end products. Great for the economy. Spain is down slightly, and as is the Republic of Ireland. So we exported 1.9 billion pounds worth of seafood around the world in 2024. That's the equivalent of 2,500 solid gold bars. So dominating these exports was salmon. Mackerel is also really significant here. Herring, nephrops, and scallops also play a sort of significant role. And that's the end of the presentation for today. I would ask you to please put any questions that you have in the Q&A section. I'll be able to then read them and we can answer for you. And if you could scan the QR code here, at Seafish we're committed to support our stakeholders. So we like to collect feedback from you, and this Slido will just take you to a very short online poll where you can let us know what more we can do to support you in the future. Thank you very much. Appreciate you taking time to listen to me today. Thank you.